We're interested in knowing to which locations and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach, so before we start, I ask you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the precise time you're listening to this narration. Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling cases documented in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. A case known as the cold case of the Eldridge brothers exists in the deep, isolated hollows of the Missouri Ozarks, where the hills rise like ancient sentinels and valleys conceal secrets beneath layers of mist and memory. It was 1873 when America was still recovering from the Civil War's wounds and the isolated communities of the Ozarks lived by their own unwritten rules. Shannon County, Missouri, with its limestone caves and thick forests, was known primarily for its isolation and the fierce independence of its residents, and the county seat was Eminence, a small settlement that was little more than a collection of wooden buildings grouped near the current river. However, law was frequently whatever the strongest family in the area decided. The Eldridge brothers case was first reported by a St. Louis journalist named Thomas Whitley in October 1873. According to county records that Whitley reviewed, two brothers, Isaiah and Jeremiah Eldridge, had set up a homestead about 7 miles northeast of Eminence in a remote hollow that was only reachable by a meandering dirt trail that became nearly impassable during the frequent rains. The Eldridge property was about 40 acres of rough, mostly forested land with a small clearing where they had constructed a 2-room cabin and several outbuildings. What caught Whitley's attention was not the property itself, but rather the circumstances surrounding its abandonment and the subsequent discovery by a local trapper in the fall of 1873. Whitley's notes, which were kept in the Missouri Historical Society archives until they were transferred to microfilm in 1961, state that the Eldridge brothers had come to Shannon County sometime in 1869, claiming to be Confederate Army veterans looking for a peaceful place to start a new life. The brothers kept to themselves, rarely leaving the county except to sell moonshine and buy supplies they couldn't make themselves. Jeremiah, the older brother, who was about 35 years old, was described in the county records as a tall, gaunt man with a strange intensity to his gaze that made people uneasy, while Isaiah, who was younger by about 3 years, was said to be more gregarious but still reserved by local standards. The brothers' background before coming to Shannon County was largely unknown, although there were rumors that they had fled from somewhere in Kentucky after some unidentified trouble. The case is particularly noteworthy because between 1869 and 1873, at least 7 travelers were reported to have vanished while passing through the area around the Eldridge property. However, the disappearances were largely uninvestigated because Shannon County did not have a formal sheriff at the time, and because of the remoteness of the area, travelers often passed through without anyone paying close attention to their arrival or departure. When a local trapper named Silas McCready happened upon the Eldridge property in September of 1873 while pursuing a wounded deer, he looked further and discovered something that would eventually lead to the documentation of the case. According to his sworn statement, which was recorded by a circuit judge who visited the county the following month, McCready discovered a strange arrangement of stones behind the main outbuilding, partially hidden by recently disturbed soil, and what he discovered beneath those stones was only described in the official record as evidence of wrongdoing sufficient to warrant further investigation. This purposeful ambiguity in the official documentation has been a point of contention throughout history. Whitley's personal notes, on the other hand, were more specific, describing personal effects belonging to individuals who were not members of the Eldridge household, arranged in a way that suggested a ritual significance rather than simple storage. The Eldridge brothers had disappeared by the time authorities arranged a proper search of the property, leaving a gap that would soon be filled with rumors, conjecture, and slowly mounting evidence of something far more sinister than moonshining or even the occasional robbery of travelers. The investigation, as it was in rural Missouri in 1873, revealed a number of oddities about the brothers and their remote homestead. First, a detailed ledger was discovered in the main cabin, concealed under a loose floorboard. Written in a meticulous hand later credited to Jeremiah Eldridge, the ledger included entries from 1866 3 years before the brothers were said to have arrived in Shannon County, and each entry followed a similar pattern: a date, a description of an individual, usually a single traveler, but sometimes a pair, and a series of mysterious notations that included weights, measurements, and what seemed to be observations about suitability and quality. In the ledger's final pages were what one investigator called recipes, although the ingredients listed were mostly unintelligible and could only be identified by initials or symbols. The second important discovery was made when investigators started a more thorough investigation of the property. They discovered a small smokehouse behind the cabin, partially concealed by a stand of oak trees. This type of structure was fairly common at the time, but what was unusual was the way the floor was built. Instead of the rough wooden planking or packed earth that were typical of such structures, the Eldridge Smokehouse had a carefully constructed stone floor with unique drainage channels that led to a covered pit about 6 feet deep. A woman named Martha Calloway, whose farm was located approximately 3 miles from the Eldridge property, told investigators that she had twice seen the brothers leading heavily laden mules toward Eminence well after midnight. When asked what the brothers might have been transporting, Calloway reportedly responded only that, whatever it was, they took uncommon care with it, like it was precious to them, and they covered it complete with canvas and rope. This is the third and possibly most unsettling aspect of the case. Jacob Thornton, a storekeeper in Eminence, supplied other information that further tainted the brothers' activities. According to Thornton's ledgers, the Eldridges frequently bought unusual amounts of salt, black pepper, and a substance he noted as preserving powder, probably saltpeter, which was widely used in meat preservation at the time. What was remarkable about these purchases was not only their quantity, but also their timing. The brothers bought them at any time of year, while most locals only engaged in large-scale meat preservation in the cool autumn. Had it not been for the arrival in Eminence in November 1873 of a man named Frederick Pearson, who identified himself as a detective from the Pinkerton Agency in Street, Louis, hired by the family of a missing businessman named Walter Hammond, the investigation might have ended there. With suspicious circumstances, but no concrete evidence of wrongdoing beyond perhaps the illegal production of moonshine. According to Pearson's report, which was later partially published by the Street Louisville Post-Dispatch, Hammond had been traveling through southern Missouri in August of that year with the intention of evaluating timber prospects for a Street Louis Lumber Company, and his last known location had been a small tavern in Van Buren, about 30 miles northeast of Eminence, where he had told the proprietor that he intended to investigate prospects in Shannon County. Pearson's investigation led him to the abandoned Eldridge property, where he conducted a far more thorough search than local authorities had managed. What he discovered in the root cellar beneath the main cabin caused him to immediately dispatch a rider to Eminence, requesting additional investigators and proper tools for excavation. The Pinkerton detective's findings were documented in a report that was classified and sealed by order of the circuit judge, ostensibly to prevent public panic. According to courthouse records, that report remained sealed until 1937, when a flood damaged portions of the Shannon County Courthouse, leading to the relocation of numerous historical documents. During this process, the Pearson report was apparently misfiled and subsequently discovered by a court clerk named Abigail Winters. Winters made a copy of the report before returning the original to the courthouse archives. Her copy eventually found its way to historian Gerald McKinney, who included portions of it in his 1952 book, Forgotten Crimes of the Ozarks. The book received little attention outside academic circles and went out of print after a single small run. In 1968, the remaining copies were recalled and purchased by an anonymous collector, making the text extremely rare today. The detective discovered evidence that the Eldridge brothers had been involved in far more sinister activities than moonshining or robbery, according to the parts of the Pearson report that McKenna's book quotes. The root cellar held specialized tools, such as a number of specially made knives with oddly shaped blades, a set of butcher's hooks that had been altered for an unknown reason, and most telling of all, a collection of personal belongings, including watches, rings, wallets, and other effects that were reportedly taken from several people. Pearson and his team's expansion of their search to the area surrounding the smokehouse, however, was what turned the case from a presumed series of robberies and potential murders into something far more sinister. Using information taken from the ledger, they discovered a series of systematic excavations that extended in a rough semicircle around the smokehouse, the content of which was only described in the report as remains inconsistent with traditional burial practices and suggesting knowledge of preservation techniques not common to the region. The most troubling part of the Pearson report, however, was not what was found at the Eldridge property, but rather what was found when investigators started following the brothers' whereabouts and relationships. Pearson interviewed Springfield, Missouri merchants and found that the Eldridges had been regularly shipping goods to Springfield, about 100 miles northwest of their property in Shannon County, and that a butcher named William Gresham told investigators that he had bought what he thought were venison and wild boar from the brothers at least 6 times between 1870 and 1873, paying premium prices for the products, which he then sold to some of Springfield's more upscale establishments. When Pearson discovered financial documents showing that the Eldridge brothers had opened an account at the Merchants Bank of Springfield in 1870 with an initial deposit of $2,300, a significant amount for supposedly impoverished homesteaders, and that by 1873 their account had grown to over $3,000 with additional deposits after their visits to Springfield, the investigation took a darker turn. One of the case's enduring mysteries is what happened to the Eldridge brothers, who vanished from Shannon County in September 1873, despite a manhunt that spanned southern Missouri and into Arkansas, but no confirmed sightings of either man were ever recorded. For years, there were rumors that the brothers had fled to Texas, that they had been killed by relatives of their victims, and that they had simply set up a new operation in another remote area. In 1887, a man who fit Jeremiah Eldridge's description was reported to be running a small meat market in Shreveport, Louisiana, but the shop had already been abandoned by the time authorities looked into it. Similarly, in 1891, a homesteader in the Colorado Territory who identified himself as Isaiah Smith was suspected by neighbors that he was the younger Eldridge brother, but no formal investigation was ever carried out. The case might have faded entirely from public memory had it not been for a discovery made in 1952 during the construction of a new county road near the former Eldridge property. Brookers excavating an area approximately half a mile from the original cabin site uncovered what was initially believed to be a Native American burial. Upon closer examination, however, archaeologists determined that the site contained the remains of at least 3 individuals buried sometime in the 1870 seconds. According to the archaeological report filed with the University of Missouri in 1953, the bones showed evidence of skilled butchery consistent with professional meat processing techniques. More disturbingly, the report noted that certain bones typically left intact in conventional burial were absent, while others showed signs of having been subjected to smoking or curing processes similar to those used in meat preservation. The archaeological findings revived interest in the hot Eldridge case among historians and criminologists. What made the discovery particularly relevant to the Eldridge case was the condition of the remains. In 1955, criminologist Dr. Lawrence Holbrook of Washington University in St. Louis published a paper suggesting that the Eldridge brothers might represent one of the earliest documented cases of serial killers operating with a profit motive rather than purely psychological compulsions. According to Holbrook's analysis, the brothers had developed a system whereby they identified and targeted travelers passing through the remote region, murdered them for their valuables, and then, in a macabre innovation, processed and sold portions of the victims' remains as exotic game meat to unsuspecting urban customers. This theory, while disturbing, would explain the brothers' unexplained wealth, their regular purchases of preservation materials, and the specialized tools found at their property. Holbrook's paper attracted considerable academic attention, but was largely dismissed by local Shannon County historians who considered it sensationalistic and damaging to the region's reputation. Following several heated exchanges in academic journals, Holbrook abandoned his research on the case. His papers and notes were donated to Washington University's archives upon his death in 1967, but were reportedly lost during a cataloging error in 1968. In 1962, a journalist named Martin Keaton attempted to revive interest in the case through a series of articles for the Kansas City Star. Creighton traveled to Shannon County and spent several weeks interviewing elderly residents who claimed to have family connections to people involved in the original investigation. Most of these accounts were secondhand at best, but one interview stood out for its unusual detail and credibility. Creighton located 9 one-year-old Emmett McCready, the son of Silas McCready, the trapper who had first discovered the abandoned Eldridge property. According to the younger McCready, his father had shared details of the case that never appeared in official reports. Most notably, Silas had allegedly told his son that what he found beneath the stones behind the outbuilding was not merely personal effects, but rather glass jars containing preserved human tissue, arranged as if on display. Furthermore, Emmett claimed that his father had discovered a hidden compartment in the cabin containing what appeared to be a journal written by Jeremiah Eldridge. Unlike the ledger found by investigators, which primarily contained transaction-like entries, this journal allegedly contained the elder Eldridge's personal reflections on his activities. According to Emmett, his father had been so disturbed by the contents that he burned the journal rather than turning it over to authorities. While Creighton found Emmett McCready's account compelling, he was unable to corroborate it with any contemporary evidence. His series of articles attracted little attention outside Missouri, and the Kansas City Star discontinued it after just 3 installments, citing public disinterest. The latest major development in the Eldridge case occurred in 1968 when renovations at the old Shannon County Courthouse uncovered a sealed metal box in a wall cavity. The box, which had apparently been placed there sometime in the 1870s, contained a number of items related to the investigation, including daguerreotypes of the Eldridge property, a partial transcription of Jeremiah's ledger, and most importantly, a sealed glass vial containing what appeared to be preserved tissue samples taken from the smokehouse site. Uncertain of what to do with such a discovery, county officials apparently turned to the FBI for help, and within days 2 federal agents arrived to seize the box and its contents. No additional information about their analysis or conclusions has ever been made public, and historians have failed to obtain any relevant FBI files through Freedom of Information Act requests. What makes the Eldridge case particularly unsettling is not merely the brothers' apparent crimes, but the methodical, almost clinical nature of their operation. Unlike many murderers of the era, whose crimes were typically impulsive acts of passion or desperation, the evidence suggests that the Eldridges approached their activities with a calculated precision more reminiscent of modern serial killers. The ledger entries, with their careful measurements and evaluations, indicate a level of detachment and planning that criminologists find especially disturbing. Dr. Eleanor Mayhew, a forensic psychologist who reviewed the available evidence in 1964, noted in an unpublished monograph that the brothers appeared to have developed a systematic approach to selecting victims based on specific criteria, primarily targeting solitary male travelers of substantial build who would not be immediately missed. The remarkable aspect of the Eldridge case, Mayhew wrote, is not that such crimes occurred in a remote region during a lawless period, but rather the evident sophistication of the perpetrators in terms of victim selection, evidence concealment, and the creation of a profitable secondary enterprise from their primary criminal activity. One of the most troubling aspects of the case is this secondary enterprise, the apparent processing and sale of human remains as game meat. William Gresham, the Springfield butcher who bought meat from the brothers, later testified that the Eldridges had marketed their products as special venison and heritage boar, claiming the unique flavor came from the animal's diet of specific Ozark herbs and roots. Gresham's testimony, recorded during an interview with Pinkerton Detective Pearson in December 1873, included the unsettling observation that the meat supplied by the Eldridges commanded the highest prices from his wealthiest clients. Folk would ask special for it, Gresham said. Said it had a flavor unlike any game they'd had before. According to Pearson's notes, at least 3 prominent Springfield citizens, a banker, a judge, and a physician had standing orders for the brothers' products, considering them a delicacy reserved for special occasions and important guests. Some claimed it gave them unusual vigor, like a tonic medicine. This belief in the medicinal or invigorating properties of the meat sold by the Eldridges adds another layer of macabre fascination to the case. The social status of those who had unintentionally eaten the brothers' products complicated the investigation into the Eldridge case, and when Pearson started introducing the brothers to Springfield's elite through their meat sales, he apparently came under increasing pressure to handle the matter discreetly. In a letter to his Pinkerton supervisor and street, Moy, dated January 17, 1874, Pearson wrote that representatives of several powerful Springfield families approached him and asked him to think about the wider implications of his investigation. These gentlemen expressed concern, in fine, Pearson wrote, not for the Eldridge brothers, whom they readily condemned, but for the reputations of those who had innocently partaken of what might turn out to be tainted goods. They were concerned that making the entire situation public would destroy respectable households and erode public trust in the area's businesses. Many aspects of the Eldridge case are still unsolved, whether because of this pressure or just the difficulties of investigating crimes that occurred decades ago in a remote area. For example, the number of victims has never been definitively determined. Pearson's report listed 7 people who had vanished in the area of the Eldridge property between 1869 and 1873. But the ledger found in the cabin contained entries indicating a much higher count, possibly dating back to the brothers' time in Kentucky prior to their arrival in Missouri. The most comprehensive analysis of the case was conducted in 1967 by a University of Missouri graduate student named Rebecca Thornhill, whose master's thesis in criminology attempted to reconcile the various historical accounts and evidence. Thornhill's research, which included interviews with descendants of Shannon County residents from the 1872nd and a review of previously unpublished court documents, proposed that the Eldridge brothers may have been responsible for as many as 21 disappearances over a 7-year period. Thornhill's thesis also explored a particularly disturbing aspect of the case that had received little previous attention: the possibility that the Eldridges had not worked alone. Through analysis of local records and contemporary accounts, she identified at least 3 occasions when the brothers had been seen in eminence, while simultaneously smoke had been observed rising from the chimney of their cabin miles away in the hollow. This observation led Thornhill to propose that the brothers might have had an accomplice, possibly a family member or associate, who had never been identified. She noted several references in local accounts to a simple-minded cousin who occasionally visited the Eldridges, though no official record of such an individual exists in county documents. Thornhill's theory of a third participant in the Eldridge operation gained more support in 1968 when it was discovered that the sealed box in the Shannon County Courthouse contained a daguerreotype of the Eldridge cabin, with a third figure standing near the smokehouse in the background, partially obscured by shadow. The image quality makes it impossible to positively identify the third participant, but the figure's posture and build differ from those of either of the Eldridge brothers in other photographs, adding another layer of mystery to the already complicated case. Did they flee with the brothers when the homestead was abandoned in 1873, or might they have stayed in the area, perhaps even assimilated into the local community while knowing about the brothers' activities? This possibility takes on particular significance in light of an incident that occurred in Eminence in 1879, 6 years after the Eldridge brothers' disappearance. According to court records, a drifter named Thomas Leach was arrested after attempting to sell personal items belonging to a recently disappeared traveler. During questioning, Leach reportedly claimed that he had learned his trade from masters of the craft and made reference to the hollow where the smoke never stops. When investigators attempted to question Leach further about these statements, they found him dead in his cell, apparently having taken his own life by means of a concealed razor. The incident was briefly investigated but ultimately dismissed as the desperate act of a common criminal seeking to create mystery around himself. In retrospect, however, Thornhill and other researchers have suggested that Leach's statements and subsequent death may represent a tangential connection to the Eldridge case that was overlooked by contemporary authorities. The potential geographic scope of the Eldridge brothers' activities presents another unresolved aspect of the case. While the focus of the original investigation centered on their Shannon County property, subsequent research has identified similar patterns of disappearances and unusual meat sales in other regions where individuals matching the brothers' descriptions were reported to have resided. In particular, records from Harlan County, Kentucky, indicate that between 1864 and 1869, immediately preceding the brothers' arrival in Missouri, at least 4 travelers disappeared while passing through a remote area locally known as Stillhouse Hollow. During this same period, a pair of brothers named Edward and John Smith operated a small smokehouse in the region, selling what they described as mountain-raised venison to merchants in the larger town of Harlem. The parallel with the Eldridge operation in Missouri is striking, though no contemporary connection was ever made between the Smith brothers of Kentucky and the Eldridges of Missouri. It was not until 1963, when historian Patricia Donovan was researching disappearances in the Appalachian region during the post-Civil War period, that the potential link was identified. Donovan discovered a record in the Harlan County Courthouse indicating that Edward and John Smith had abruptly departed the region in early 1869, following an incident described only as unwelcome scrutiny from outside parties. The timing aligns perfectly with the Eldridge brothers' arrival in Shannon County, Missouri, later that same year. Furthermore, a physical description of Edward Smith in the Harlan County records bears a remarkable resemblance to that of Jeremiah Eldridge in the Missouri documents. Both men are described as tall and gaunt, with a distinctive scar extending from the left ear to the corner of the mouth. This particular detail was not included in any published accounts of the Eldridge case and appears only in the original court documents, making the correlation especially compelling. If Edward and John Smith were Jeremiah and Isaiah Eldridge acting under false pretenses, it would indicate a pattern of systematic operations across several states and possibly dozens of victims over almost 10 years, where the brothers would settle in a remote area, grow their operation over years, and then move when local suspicion or outside investigation threatened to expose them. This pattern could also explain the brothers' eventual disappearance from Shannon County in 1873, where they may have simply moved to another remote area and resumed their activities under new identities. Reports of people looking like the brothers in Louisiana in 1887 and Colorado in 1891 may be later iterations of their operation, but neither was sufficiently investigated at the time to provide a conclusive link. The Eldridge brothers might have been part of a larger network of like-minded individuals operating throughout the frontier regions of post-Civil War America, a period of significant population movement, limited law enforcement in remote areas, and a general atmosphere of societal disruption that could have provided cover for organized criminal activities. This is one of the most troubling possibilities raised by modern analysis of the Eldridge case. Dr. Holbrook briefly considered this possibility in his 1955 analysis, noting that the sophistication of the Eldridge operation, particularly their ability to market and distribute their products through legitimate commercial channels, suggested a level of organization that might extend beyond 2 isolated individuals. But he ultimately concluded that the evidence was insufficient to support such a theory. The potential existence of a broader network takes on new significance in light of a discovery made in 1966 during the renovation of a historic hotel in Springfield, Missouri. Workers removing a section of wall in what had once been the hotel's kitchen uncovered a small tin box containing a single sheet of paper. The document, written in a cramped, precise hand, listed 12 sets of initials, each followed by a location designated only by a letter and number combination. Among the entries was JNIE, or SC, which some researchers have interpreted as referring to Jeremiah and Isaiah Eldridge in Shannon County. If this interpretation is correct, the document might represent a record of individuals engaged in similar activities throughout the region, with the letter number combinations indicating specific territories or operational areas. The document was turned over to local authorities who, finding no evidence of recent criminal activity, eventually transferred it to the Missouri Historical Society. There it remained largely forgotten until 1969, when researcher Martin Catone came across it while investigating another matter. Creighton immediately recognized the potential connection to the Eldridge case and attempted to analyze the other initials and location codes on the list. His efforts yielded limited results, though he did identify 2 other sets of initials that potentially corresponded to unsolved disappearances in Missouri and Arkansas during the same period. Before he could complete his analysis, however, Keaton suffered a severe stroke that left him unable to continue his work. His notes on the subject were reportedly among the materials donated to the University of Missouri archives upon his death in 1972, but they have never been conclusively located. However, the majority of scholars who have examined the case maintain that the evidence more strongly supports the theory that the Eldridges operated independently, developing their particular methodology through trial and error, rather than as part of an organized network. The distinctive aspects of their operation, particularly the processing and sale of human remains as exotic meat, have few documented parallels in criminal history, suggesting an innovative approach rather than an established practice. The discovery of the list raises troubling questions about the scope and organization of potential criminal networks in the post-Civil War frontier. If the Eldridge brothers were in fact a larger association of people involved in similar activities, the implications for historical understanding of crime during that era would be significant. The psychological profile of the Eldridge brothers is another topic of continuing interest and discussion among scholars. In contrast to many of the criminals of their time who left behind letters, confessions, or other unambiguous statements of their motivations, the brothers were almost entirely silent in their documentation about the reason or purpose of their actions, and the ledger in their cabin with its clinical notations and measurements may be the only direct window into their thoughts. The systematic nature of these entries, with its emphasis on physical attributes and quality evaluations, points to people who saw their victims more as resources than as human beings, a viewpoint that criminologists refer to as extreme objectification, which is typical of the most dangerous kinds of serial offenders. Dr. Mayhew, in her 1964 analysis, proposed that this objectification might have its roots in the brothers' experiences during the Civil War. If they did indeed serve in the Confederate Army, as they claimed upon their arrival in Shannon County, they would have been exposed to the mass casualties and dehumanization inherent in that conflict. For individuals with certain pre-existing psychological tendencies, such exposure could potentially normalize violence and diminish the perceived value of human life. This theory gained additional support in 1965 when a military historian named Robert Canfield discovered records indicating that two brothers named Eldridge had served in the 5th Kentucky Infantry Regiment, Confederate, during the war. The regiment had participated in several of the conflict's bloodiest engagements, including the Battle of Shiloh, where casualties were particularly severe. More significantly, the regiment's records indicate that during the winter of 1863 to 1864, when supplies were critically low, several soldiers were court-martialed for robbing the dead and, in at least one case, for the unlawful consumption of flesh not proper for human sustenance. While the records do not specifically name the Eldridge brothers in connection with these incidents, their presence in the regiment during this period suggests possible exposure to extreme survival situations that might have influenced their subsequent behavior. The potential connection to wartime experiences offers one of the few plausible explanations for the brothers' evolution from apparent conventional soldiers to methodical killers and processors of human remains. The transition from the battlefield, where killing is sanctioned and dead bodies are commonplace, to civilian life can be challenging even for psychologically healthy individuals. For those with predispositions toward violence or sociopathy, the contrast between wartime and peacetime norms might create a context in which deviant behaviors could develop and escalate. This theory is supported by the apparent timeline of the brothers' activities. If the connection to Edward and John Smith of Harlan County, Kentucky is valid, then their criminal operations began shortly after the conclusion of the Civil War, a period when they would have been transitioning from military to civilian life, while also dealing with the broader societal disruption of the post-war South. The progression from their early activities in Kentucky to the more sophisticated operation in Missouri would then represent an evolution of both methodology and scale. What might have begun as opportunistic predation on vulnerable travelers could have developed into the systematic operation documented in Shannon County, with its specialized tools, record-keeping, and commercial distribution network. This developmental pattern aligns with modern understanding of serial offenders, who typically refine their methods through experience and repetition. The brothers' apparent success in evading detection over a period of years would have reinforced their behaviors while allowing them to perfect their techniques, both for killing and processing victims, and for concealing evidence of their activities. The most troubling psychological aspect of the Eldridge case is the apparent lack of the emotional or sexual motivations that are typically associated with serial killers. The evidence indicates that the Eldridges saw murder primarily as a means to a financial end, which is a perspective that criminologists find particularly troubling due to its cold rationality. This profit motive, along with the methodical record-keeping that is documented in the ledger, places the brothers in a rare category of offenders that bridges the gap between organized crime and serial killers. Their operation, with its focus on resource extraction, both valuables and remains from victims, and subsequent monetization through legal commercial channels, represents a disturbing blend of predatory violence and entrepreneurial calculation. The Eldridge case's lasting effects on the communities in which they operated go well beyond the immediate investigation and its unresolved findings. In Shannon County, the legacy of the brothers' actions was a widespread apprehension of outsiders that lasted for generations, a reluctance that many researchers who tried to look into the case encountered strong opposition. Martin Creighton, in his notes from his 1962 visit to the area, described the response of locals when he asked about the Eldridge brothers. It's as a curtain comes down. Before, people were freely discussing local history, but now they have vital business elsewhere. Those who do react provide only the bare minimum of recognition that the brothers ever existed, typically followed by reassurances that whatever transpired was long ago and best forgotten. This collective reluctance points to a collective reaction to trauma, a collective choice to disassociate oneself from events too upsetting to integrate into their collective identity. Such tendencies have been noted in other sites linked to infamous crimes, where locals frequently create protective narratives that downplay or externalize the atrocity that took place among them. In Springfield, Missouri, where the brothers' products had been bought and consumed by unintentional customers, the reaction was different. Instead of widespread silence, the community went through what one modern observer called a season of digestive hysteria, when the nature of the Eldridge brothers' business was revealed in early 1874. The Springfield Republican newspaper reported that local doctors were inundated with patients who claimed to have suffered from mysterious illnesses that they attributed to eating meat from establishments known to have dealt with the Eldridges. Although the majority of these complaints were probably psychosomatic reactions to the unsettling disclosure, the episode shows the case's profound psychological impact on those who feared they had been unintentionally drawn into the brothers' gruesome business. The enduring fascination with the Eldridge case among researchers, despite the fragmentary nature of the evidence and the passage of nearly 150 years, speaks to its unique position at the intersection of multiple categories of historical interest: criminal history, post-Civil War, social dynamics, frontier justice or its absence, and the dark potential of human psychology when unrestrained by social constraints or effective law enforcement. Unlike many historical crimes that have faded from collective memory, the Eldridge case continues to generate new analyses and interpretations with each passing decade. Its persistence in scholarly discourse may reflect the fundamental unresolved nature of the case, the absence of definitive answers regarding the brothers' fate, the total extent of their crimes, or the full truth of their operation leaves space for continued investigation and speculation. This quality of irresolution resonates with a broader theme in American frontier history: the tension between the documented and the unknowable. Just as the wilderness that once covered the continent has been largely tamed and charted, the dark corners of human behavior represented by cases like that of the Eldridge brothers resist complete illumination, remaining shadowy territories on the map of our understanding. The Eldridge brothers' Shannon County homestead is now physically inside the boundaries of the Mark Twain National Forest, reachable only by a rarely used hiking trail that is not marked on most maps. And the cabin and outbuildings have long since reverted to earth, leaving only faint depressions in the forest floor to indicate their former presence. Though impossible to objectively verify, locals continue to report strange experiences in the area, such as a persistent silence, as if the forest itself holds its breath, or the faint smell of smoke when no fire is burning. In 1975, a team of University of Missouri archaeology students sought to undertake a systematic survey of the site as part of a larger study of 19th-century homesteads in the Ozarks. But according to their field notes, the project was abandoned after 3 days due to equipment malfunctions and unfavorable conditions. One participant, speaking anonymously to a student newspaper upon returning to campus, reported feeling like they were being watched the entire time they were at the site. Whether these accounts are the result of real paranormal activity, the influence of suggestion on those who are aware of the site's past, or just the natural uneasiness that can occur in remote areas, they add to the ongoing mystery surrounding the Eldridge case. The hollow where the brothers once lived has become a place where history and folklore converge, where the documented horrors of the past coexist with the more enigmatic fears of the present. Dr. Howard Mitchell of the Missouri State Archaeological Survey organized a more extensive archaeological investigation in 1,982 inches, the hopes of answering some of the unanswered questions regarding the physical evidence at the Staters' site. With the right tools and a team of knowledgeable researchers, Mitchell spent 2 weeks conducting a methodical survey of about 5 acres surrounding the cabin's presumed location. Their findings, which were reported in the Journal of Historical Archaeology in 1983, included the main cabin's stone foundation, parts of the unusual drainage system connected to the smokehouse, and most importantly, a series of small, regular depressions that extended in an arc behind where the outbuildings would have stood. These excavations corresponded to the methodical excavations described in the Pearson Report from 1873, when forensic anthropologist Dr. Eleanor Wilkins conducted laboratory analysis following the excavation of several of these depressions. She found bone fragments that Mitchell's team had initially identified as animal remains, but that at least some of the fragments were human in origin, and that many of the bones showed clear evidence of butchery, with fine-grained saw marks consistent with careful sectioning rather than violent dismemberment. Wilkins's findings were particularly troubling because the remains' carbon dating placed them between 1,865 and 1,875, which is exactly when the Eldridge brothers occupied the site. This was the first scientifically verified physical evidence linking the brothers to the processing of human remains, confirming a key aspect of the historical accounts that some researchers had previously questioned. Buttons, a pocket watch case, and a gold wedding band bearing the initials MLH to WH, 1,868, which may have been connected to Walter Hammond, the missing businessman whose disappearance had first brought Pinkerton detective Frederick Pearson to Shannon County in 1873, were among the small personal items recovered from the site by Mitchell's team. Although these findings were significant, they left many aspects of the case open-ended, with the number of victims, the extent of the brothers' operation, and their eventual fate remaining questions of speculation rather than proven facts. Mitchell ended his report by noting that the archaeological record, while confirming the disturbing reality at the core of the Eldridge case, can only hint at the full scope of their activities. The personal backgrounds of the Eldridge brothers themselves represent another area where fact and speculation have often blended. The claim that they were Confederate veterans appears to be substantiated by the military records discovered by historian Robert Canfield, but their lives before and after the war remain largely obscure. In 1984, genealogist Margaret Holloway attempted to trace the brothers' family connections through census records and other public documents. Her research, published in the Journal of American Genealogy, identified a Jeremiah and Isaiah Eldridge born to a tenant farming family in eastern Tennessee in 1838 and 1841 respectively, ages that would align with the descriptions of the Shannon County brothers. According to Holloway's findings, the Eldridge family relocated to Harlan County, Kentucky in the early 1852s, where the father worked as a butcher's assistant before his death in 1858. This detail takes on particular significance in light of the brothers' later activities, suggesting that they may have acquired their knowledge of meat processing through family occupation rather than through independent experimentation. Holloway's research also uncovered a significant gap in the documented history of the Eldridge brothers between their presumed enlistment in the Confederate Army in 1861 and their appearance in Harlan County as Edward and John Smith in 1864. This period, coinciding with the most intense years of the Civil War, might have been formative in the development of their particular pathology. Military historian James Donovan, building on Holloway's work, proposed in a 1986 article that the brothers might have served not only in conventional combat roles, but potentially in irregular units engaged in behind-the-lines operations. Such units, operating with limited supervision and engaged in activities including sabotage, assassination, and terror tactics against civilian populations, existed on both sides of the conflict. Donovan noted that the 5th Kentucky Infantry, where soldiers named Eldridge were documented, was temporarily attached to a command that included several such irregular units during the winter of 1863 to 1864. While no direct evidence places the brothers in these units, Donovan suggested that exposure to their methods might have influenced the brothers' subsequent approach to violence, particularly the emphasis on secrecy, efficiency, and the disposal of evidence. This military connection, if accurate, would place the Eldridge brothers in a category of killers whose violent tendencies were shaped or activated by wartime experiences, a pattern observed in other historical cases where former soldiers have transitioned from sanctioned battlefield violence to criminal predation in civilian contexts. As forensic psychologist Dr. Rachel Simmons noted in a 2011 analysis published in the Journal of Criminal Psychology, most profit-motivated killers focus primarily on stealing valuables, or in cases like kidnapping, extracting ransom, treating the victim's body as waste to be discarded. What distinguishes the Eldridge case, Simmons wrote, is the apparent totality of the resource extraction. The brothers, in contrast to most killers who dispose of remains to conceal evidence, apparently developed a system for processing and profiting from their victims' bodies, an innovation that criminologists find particularly significant. This all-encompassing approach implies a degree of objectification and commodification of human life that surpasses even that commonly observed in serial offenders. The brothers apparently saw their victims as sources of multiple forms of value. First, the traditional portable wealth of travelers, money, watches, etc., and then the commercial value of the remains themselves. This commercial sophistication begs the question of how the brothers developed and perfected their specific methodology. If they did operate, first as the Smith brothers in Kentucky and then as the Eldridges in Missouri, the development of their methods over time would represent a disturbing learning curve, one that may have continued after they vanished from Shannon County in 1873. The sightings of people who looked like the brothers in Louisiana in 1887 and Colorado in 1891 take on further significance when viewed in this context. If these sightings were indeed the Eldridges continuing their operations in new places, they would have had nearly 2 decades to perfect their methods since their first documented operations in Kentucky, and the implications of such long-term multi-state criminal activity occurring under the radar of authorities are deeply concerning. The Eldridge case also raises questions about potential victims who may never have been identified or connected to the brothers' activities. The 7 disappearances documented in Shannon County between 1869 and 1873 likely represent only a fraction of the total if the brothers operated for years across multiple states. Historian Eliza Montgomery, in a 1992 study of unsolved disappearances in the post-Civil War frontier, identified 34 cases between 1865 and 1895 that shared characteristics, potentially connecting them to the Eldridge pattern. Lone male travelers, often carrying significant sums of money, who vanished while passing through remote areas where individuals matching the brothers' descriptions had been reported. While acknowledging that many of these disappearances might have other explanations, from natural disasters to unrelated criminal activity, Montgomery argued that at least some likely represented undocumented victims of the Eldridges or potentially of others employing similar methods. Her study highlighted the limitations of historical criminal investigation in an era before standardized record-keeping, forensic science, or effective communication between jurisdictions. The question of whether others might have adopted the Eldridge brothers' particular methodology represents another disturbing possibility. The case received limited public attention at the time, with most newspaper accounts focusing on the disappearances and robbery aspects rather than the processing and sale of remains. However, those directly involved in the investigation would have been aware of the full details, creating the potential for imitation. Thomas Leach, the drifter arrested in Eminence in 1879, who claimed to have learned his trade from masters of the craft, represents one potential example of such imitation. His apparent suicide before detailed questioning prevented investigators from determining whether his statement referred specifically to the Eldridge brothers or whether he had actual knowledge of their methods. More broadly, the remote regions of the Ozarks and Appalachia, with their isolated hollows and limited law enforcement, continued to experience occasional disappearances well into the 20th century. While most such cases likely had conventional explanations, the Eldridge case suggests the possibility that similar operations might have existed, perhaps on a smaller scale, in other locations. The cultural impact of the Eldridge case, while limited by its relative obscurity in mainstream historical accounts, has nonetheless been significant within certain contexts. In the Missouri Ozarks, particularly in Shannon County, the story has assumed the status of a dark legend, a cautionary tale about the dangers that might lurk in seemingly peaceful rural settings. Local folklore researcher Dr. Samuel Hawkins documented several variations of the Eldridge story that circulated orally in the region throughout the 20th century. In a 1997 article for the Journal of American Folklore, Hawkins noted that these versions often incorporated supernatural elements absent from the historical record. Describing the brothers as possessing unnatural strength or the ability to lure travelers through hypnotic suggestion, these folkloric adaptations, Hawkins wrote, transform the historical Eldridges from human criminals, however monstrous, into something more akin to demons or evil spirits, entities that represent a fundamental malevolence in the landscape, rather than mere human depravity. This transformation from historical figures to folkloric entities reflects a friending leaf, common pattern in the cultural processing of traumatic events. By recasting the brothers as supernatural rather than human, the community creates psychological distance from the disturbing reality that ordinary men committed such acts in their midst. The Eldridge case has also periodically attracted attention from true crime authors and documentary filmmakers, though often with significant embellishment or sensationalization. A 1976 paperback titled Butchers of the Ozarks presented a heavily fictionalized account that inserted romantic subplots and graphic violence absent from the historical record. Similarly, a 1988 low-budget documentary called American Monsters, the Eldridge brothers included dramatic reenactments that emphasize the more lurid aspects of the case while neglecting its historical context. More scholarly treatment came in 2003 when historian Richard Patterson included a chapter on the Eldridge case in his book Forgotten Horrors: Criminal Episodes in American History. Patterson's account, based on extensive archival research, placed the brothers' activities within the broader context of post-Civil War social disruption and the limited law enforcement capabilities of frontier regions. The Eldridge case, Patterson wrote, represents not an aberration, but rather an extreme manifestation of conditions that existed throughout much of the American frontier during this period. This contextual approach to understanding the Eldridge case is in line with contemporary criminological perspectives that emphasize the role of opportunity and absence of guardianship in facilitating criminal behavior. The brothers did not operate in a vacuum, but rather took advantage of particular vulnerabilities in the social and legal structures of their time and place. The isolation that drew settlers seeking independence also created spaces where predators could operate with little risk of detection or intervention. Although it is difficult to directly trace, the Eldridge case may have had an impact on the development of more coordinated approaches to investigating disappearances across jurisdictional boundaries. The challenges faced by authorities trying to track the brothers across state lines underscored the limitations of local law enforcement in dealing with mobile criminal operations. And in 1874, the governors of Missouri, Arkansas, and Kentucky formally agreed to share information about missing persons and suspected criminals operating across state lines. Although this arrangement was rudimentary by today's standards, it was a precursor to the regional and national law enforcement coordination that would develop more fully in the 20th century. The medical implications of the Eldridge brothers' activities have also attracted scholarly attention, particularly regarding the potential consequences for those who unknowingly consumed the meat sold by the brothers. Dr. Harold Winstead's observation of a cluster of neurological conditions among Springfield's elite in the 1,890 seconds potentially connected to the consumption of contaminated meat decades earlier raises disturbing possibilities about the long-term public health impact of the brothers' commerce. Modern medical researchers have noted that certain prion diseases, fatal brain disorders caused by misfolded proteins, can have incubation periods of many years or even decades. Melissa Carpenter, a neurologist who reviewed Winstead's accounts in a 2005 article for the Journal of Historical Medicine, concluded that while definitive diagnosis is impossible based on the limited historical descriptions, the pattern of symptoms described is consistent with what we now recognize as variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which can be transmitted through the consumption of contaminated neural tissue. This medical dimension adds yet another layer of horror to the Eldridge case. The possibility that the brothers' crimes continued to claim victims years or even decades after their disappearance, as those who had unknowingly consumed their products succumbed to slow-developing neurological conditions. If the brothers' customers did indeed consume human tissue, they might have been exposed to such diseases, potentially explaining the symptoms described by Winstead. The story of the Eldridge brothers is a somber reminder of the secrets that remote places can conceal, of the thin veneer of civilization that sometimes conceals unimaginable horrors, and of how easily the truth can be lost to history when those who know it choose silence over the discomfort of acknowledgement. For those who are inclined to visit Shannon County today, locals still occasionally mention the Eldridge Hollow, though few could tell you its exact location, and perhaps that's for the best. Some places marked by darkness are better left undisturbed, and some stories, no matter how compelling our need to know their endings, are perhaps best left unfinished. As one elderly Shannon County resident told Martin Creighton in 1962, there are two kinds of silence in these hills: the natural quiet that brings peace, and the heavy silence that falls when something best forgotten tries to be remembered. You learn to distinguish between the two when you're in the woods around here. The final, perhaps most unsettling aspect of the Eldridge case is the possibility that the brothers, or individuals employing their methods, might have continued operating well into the 20th century. The remote regions of the American interior, with their decreasing but still significant areas of isolation, could have provided cover for similar operations long after the original Eldridge brothers had passed from the scene. In 1956, a hunter in rural Oregon discovered an abandoned cabin containing equipment similar to that described in the Eldridge case: specialized cutting tools, a modified smokehouse, and a ledger containing entries with measurements and quality notations. Local authorities, unfamiliar with the historical Missouri case, investigated the site as a potential poaching operation. By the time historian Gerald McKinney made the connection to the Eldridge pattern in 1963, the trail had gone cold. Similarly, in 1964, a hiker in the Bitterroot Mountains of Idaho reported finding a remote camp containing preserved human remains that had been processed in a manner consistent with professional butchery. By the time authorities reached the location, the site had been cleared, with only a few scattered tools remaining as evidence that anyone had been there at all. These incidents, while impossible to connect definitively to the Eldridge legacy, suggest the disturbing possibility that their methodology might have been adopted and adapted by others, either through direct transmission of knowledge or through independent development of similar techniques. The isolated nature of such operations would make detection unlikely, particularly if the practitioners maintained the brothers' apparent discipline regarding victim selection and evidence disposal. Today, with improved forensic techniques, DNA analysis, and coordinated law enforcement databases, such operations would face greater challenges in avoiding detection. Yet, remote areas still exist where determined individuals might operate outside effective oversight, and the disappearance of hikers, transients, and other vulnerable individuals continues to occur at rates that exceed clear resolutions. The Eldridge brothers, whether they died soon after their disappearance from Shannon County or continued their activities for decades in other locations, represent a disturbing chapter in American criminal history, one that challenges comfortable assumptions about the limits of human behavior and the safety of even the most seemingly peaceful rural settings. Their legacy lives on not only in the academic studies and folklore of the Ozarks, but in the subtle weariness that still characterizes the region's approach to strangers and the persistent rumors that circulate about certain remote hollows where locals refuse to venture after dark. As one Shannon County resident told a researcher in 2012, some places hold memories that the trees won't even whisper. In the end, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Eldridge case is not what we know about the brothers and their activities, but what remains unknown. The questions that may never be fully answered about the extent of their crimes, the fate of all their victims, and whether their particular brand of methodical predation truly ended with their disappearance, or merely transformed and continued in ways yet to be discovered. Or, in the shadowed hollows of America's rural landscape, where isolation provides both sanctuary and opportunity, the conditions that allowed the Eldridge brothers to operate have never entirely disappeared. And as long as travelers venture into remote regions, following winding dirt roads to destinations others cannot easily locate, the potential for similar predators remains a dark possibility, etched into the landscape itself, as permanent as the ancient hills of the Ozarks and as quietly persistent as the fog that rises from their valleys on cold autumn mornings.